Believe we are now live. It is my hope that I'm now broadcasting. I'm not entirely positive I am, but we hope so. I'm going to start today's time with a video that was given to us by the Reverend Dr. William Ward. This is a video that is going to get us kind of into the discussion that's going to follow. So I ask you to join us for this opening video, and then we will enjoy a good conversation to follow.
If Dr. King was speaking to me right now, he would look me man to man, eye to eye, just as I'm looking at you, and he would tell me, if you can't fly, run. If you can't run, walk. And if you can't walk, crawl. But by any means necessary, keep moving.
If Dr. King gave me some advice, it would be to keep going, because what I have to offer and what I have to say is going to help our next generation.
If Dr. King were here today, I think he would tell me to always remember the mission, remember why we are in our movement. I feel like it's so easy to get bogged down in all the hate and division, but we need to keep moving forward like he always did.
If Dr. King was speaking to me right now, he would just say to keep going and to be strong, that this is not the end of the fight. Continue to fight for the next generation to come.
And in this day and age, as I said before, we're being told more and more that you don't have a voice, you're not important. But it's always important to remember to keep on moving. Whether that's reading one Bible verse a day, if you can't read the whole book in one day, we get it. If that means you just go out and say one positive thing to a neighbor, go out and do that. But by any means, keep moving. You do have a voice, you are important. That's what I believe Dr. King would say to me.
I think if there was one thing that we could do to really change where we are right now, is to love before we hate.
The one main thing that would change the state of our climate now is love. It's the simple answer. There's way too much hatred being spread across this world, and especially in this community itself.
If one thing that could change in this climate, in our country's climate, it would be acceptance. Acceptance from everyone, to understand everything and just accept each other for who they are, and where they come from and the color of their skin.
One primary thing that needs to change to help our nation's climate would be for everyone to have understanding and empathy for the next person. If you don't understand what I'm going through, don't just say it's not happening to me. Just be more understanding that this is what's going on when I leave my house. This is the things that I have to worry about when my child leaves the house.
Learning how to identify with your neighbor, getting out and talking with your neighbor. Not just the neighbor that looks like you, thinks like you, talks like you, but those that are diverse, those that don't look like you, those that don't share your same language.
I feel like we're too big to just jump the gun and insult somebody, go at somebody, but if we love before we hate, I feel like we can really reach some point of unity.
Get out and share your ideals with those that don't think like you, and don't be intimidated when someone doesn't have the same ideals as yourself.
When George Floyd was murdered, everyone said, well, I don't understand why you're marching here in Bristol, because stuff like that doesn't happen. Well, it does. And again, that goes back to understanding and being more aware.
This day and age, we're being told more and more to quiet your voices. You don't have a voice.
They expect us just to roll over and to stay quiet with being in a small town in the South.
But indeed, we do have a voice.
All of the events going on around the country really affect me here, because I feel like a lot of people don't think those things happen here, but it's pretty surreal to see people here have the same feelings that people do anywhere else in the country and the world.
So what's going on everywhere else is affecting me here in Bristol, because it affects the honest daily way that we live, the daily way that we think.
So being a biracial Bristol resident, I feel that it affects me on both sides, because on the white side, they don't understand when I speak about things, on how I feel, because to them, they're like, oh, I'm just Keisha. But as far as for the black residents in our area, I feel scared for them. I most definitely feel that we're not safe right now, that no one's protected at this moment. And so hopefully things will change.
Learn to think different, but at the same time, learn to lead in love.
I am king.
I am king.
I am love.
I am love.
I am courage.
I am courage.
I am power.
I am power.
I am wisdom.
I am wisdom.
I am legacy.
Little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today.
You deserve my love. After the way you treated me, I still give you the ghost face. I give you the ghost face. Wish I could take back my love. Because the pain, it never leaves. I still give you the ghost face. I give you the ghost face. You got hate for me, I got hope for you. You got hate for me, I got hope for you. You got hate for me, I got hope for you. You got hate for me, I got hope for you. You got hate for me, I got hope for you. You got hate for me, I got hope for you. You got hate for me, I got hope for you. You got hate for me, I got hope for you.
You may hate me, I'll keep praying, I will pray for you. You may hate me, I'll keep praying, I will pray for love, yeah.
Well, welcome to this event for the King Institute for Faith and Culture. We're delighted you could be here. This is the result of a lot of planning as a way of getting around the COVID-19 crisis. We're delighted that we're able to have some event, even though we'd prefer to be in person. The city of Bristol, of course, did its events online this afternoon. You can still see those if you haven't. There's a lot of great material there, but it sure is a lot more fun in person. But for this year, it's good to have friends around and to have a conversation related to the things that Dr. King has led us to think about, and as a way of commemorating this, his birthday. So I'm delighted to have all of you here as part of the King Institute. We have run a speaker series in Bristol since 2007, founded as the Buechner Institute for Faith and Culture. And for 3 years now, we've been joining with the city of Bristol, Twin Cities of Bristol, to have a special event for Martin Luther King Day. Last year, we had Father Gregory Boyle from Homeboy Industries in Los Angeles. The year before that, John Perkins came and spoke. And so those were both terrific events, and we're delighted this year to have these local panelists to reflect on some things that face us right here in our own community. At the end of this conversation tonight, I'm going to show you a little video by next year's speaker. She was supposed to be with us today, but of course with COVID she couldn't. Her name is Natasha Sistrunk Robinson. She's a prolific author and speaker and graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy and a former Marine captain who also does a lot of writing. And her main book that we'll be focusing on next year is called A Sojourner's Truth. So we'll have a little message from Natasha at the very end, but in the meantime, I want to introduce the people who are with me at the moment. Also to let you know, we do have a little bit more online coming up this spring, including something in a rather different vein, but also I think a prophetic voice in his way. We're going to celebrate the 700th anniversary of the death of Dante. And I have a panel for that featuring an English poet and an American columnist and a professor at Calvin University, and it's going to be great. We do have some more online coming up, but we look forward, hopefully, to being back in person this fall. Our panelists tonight come from the Tri-Cities region and do a variety of different things. Tommy Bryant, Tommy, if you'll wave at us, is assistant professor of English at Virginia Highlands Community College. He's a graduate of King and of Hollins, and he's currently enrolled in a PhD program at Old Dominion. He teaches composition classes as well as film studies at Virginia Highlands and plays on the mighty King College trivia team when COVID is not in full force. Adam Dixon is supervisor of the Langston Center in Johnson City. Adam, if you'll wave at us. There you are. And he also teaches a course in Black American political thought at East Tennessee State University. And included in that course is the use of the book that we're talking about tonight. Where do we go from here? Tina McDaniel has spent the majority of her career working in the field of human resources and telecommunications. She's had nonprofit experience with the YWCA in Northeast Tennessee and Southwest Virginia. Currently works in human resources in the healthcare industry. She's coming at us at from a more business standpoint, as well as nonprofit. She's married with a son, and she is one of the coordinators for Bristol's citywide MLK celebration, and a facilitator with Be the Bridge, a racial reconciliation group that has really thrived in Bristol in the last couple of years. Tina is passionate about race reconciliation, justice, and diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I didn't ask you to wave, Tina, so you want to wave at us. There you go. Renee, will you wave at us as well? Renee Rogers is the head curator at the Birthplace of Country Music Museum in Bristol, Virginia. And if you have not been, you should come see it. It is a terrific museum, a Smithsonian affiliate, and a real treasure to our city. She's a member of the board of the Tennessee Association of Museums as well. Native of Bristol, she attended William and Mary before doing a PhD in Roman history at the University of Durham in England, and lived and worked there for many, many years. And last but not least, the Reverend William Ward, Reverend Dr. William Ward. I don't see him, but his photo's there. The Reverend Dr. Ward is the pastor of Hood Memorial and Harris Anderson AME Zion churches on both sides of the state line here in Bristol. He's studied at a variety of places, including some work at Princeton Theological Seminary. So delighted to welcome all five of you all today, and really pleased that you can bring such different perspectives to the discussion of where do we go from here, chaos or community. Before we get into the book a little bit, I want to ask a quick question about its title. What's interesting to me in the way that Dr. King titles the book is that those two words, chaos and community, do not appear to be opposites. If I were going to think of the opposite of community, I would think of isolation. If I think of the opposite of chaos, I think of order. What do you make of the title of this book?
I guess for me, Martin, I'll go ahead and answer. Whenever I think about chaos and community, one of the things that as I read the book, Dr. King has such deep insight into the future. Whenever I read the book, it was as if he were here today. So I think he knew if we did not respond to certain things like the three evils that he mentions, poverty, racism, and militarism and violence, he felt like we would self-destruct. So I feel like the title has to do with, if we don't address these three imperatives, then as a civilization, we will self-destruct.
We don't have the option of everybody living on their own 40 acres. We live together and we got to get it right or it's going to be a disaster. That really struck me, especially in view of last week's events, as I was looking back at the book these last few days. Well, I want to begin with a little bit of a look at the past and a look at the history of the book before we look at how it maybe leads us into the future. And I'm curious from any of you who want to comment on this, how does this fit into Martin Luther King's career? How does it fit into the civil rights movement more broadly? What can we learn about this book in its own context in 1967?
Martin, what I gather is the evolution of Dr. King's ideology. I think you're seeing an individual that by 1967 he's seen some larger pieces of a puzzle. Say by 1964, by 1965, you've passed the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. And the assumption is that these key pieces of legislation are going to move, particularly Black people, forward. You've got a president who is awfully excited to have these two pieces of legislation passed because for him it was an exhibition of muscle. He really proved to everybody that he had the power to really make the Congress work, and also to kind of show the Southern wing of the Congress of the United States that he had the ultimate power to make things happen. So the assumption is things are really moving forward with the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, but then you see the pain of Watts, the pain of Chicago. You know, you see urban poverty up close and personal. And then we also begin to see how, again, race and poverty are connected to a Vietnam War. Black folks don't have any rights in the United States, but yet they're on the front lines in Vietnam. So Dr. King is evolving by 1967, and one would surmise that here he is at the apex, of his influence in 1964-65, but yet he's going to turn right around and look to the same president that he has a direct line to, a close relationship with, and say, I disagree with this war. Your heart, and I think this goes back to your first question, your heart was right, Mr. President, President Johnson, with the Great Society, but somehow you've gotten veered off into this chaos of Vietnam. And Dr. King turns right back around and says, I cannot walk with you. So to me, the political climate, the king of 1967 is a king that is evolving, a king that is growing, a king that is, again, really connecting some key dynamics together. And the African American community by 1967 does not really understand where the man is or where the man's going. And the bulk of the country doesn't either.
Other thoughts about how we read this book in terms of its historical context or its moment?
Just building off what Adam was just saying is, and I think you see this a lot. I mean, we live in a world of sound bites and social media and all of that right now, is that the king that we're talking about in this book and that we were reading about is not the king that tends to show up in those sound bites and in those social media posts. And understanding that full person is so important. I saw something today on social media that had been shared from, I think, Bernice King about, you know, this is, my father wasn't just this one thing, he was all these things. And I think that's really important because I think it's something that people don't think about. They want to just look at one aspect and not look at the whole person and what that meant to the movement.
So in what ways do you think the king of this book in 1967 has changed? What are the distinctions?
I think there's a level of disillusionment at this point. You've seen these monumental victories, and I kind of went back and looked at the mantle that was on Dr. King. If you look back, 1865, the 13th Amendment was passed, and then you have like 100 years before there's anything that really happens that moves Black people forward. So then you have these, key pieces of legislation, but then he realizes, even though you have this legislation, it doesn't mean that legislation is going to be enforced. So I think there was a level of disillusionment, and even concern about, okay, what is this movement going to look like going forward? And how can I prepare those who come after me to carry it forward? So I think that he was a bit disillusioned at this point.
What about thinking in terms of situation? We're now 53 years out from the 54 years out now from the writing of the book. How much is the world that we're facing similar to that disillusioning moment for Dr. King in 67, and how much has it changed? And I guess I'm wondering about the contemporary relevance of the book. How is it that we read this little snapshot in time and now we look at today? How similar is the situation?
Well, and I think you see something that's not just in the Black community, but you see people who feel disenfranchised to act out. That's when the phrase Black Power was first spoken. You know, they just felt sort of disenfranchised and things weren't moving forward, and they sort of spoke out. And I think, you know, what happened last week is just sort of people who feel disenfranchised and they're sort of acting out. It's sort of interesting, though, to see that happen in a country like this, where the overwhelming laws and things that are put in place favor people who look like that, and they still feel disenfranchised. So I think that gives you really a good glimpse of what African American people have been struggling with from the start. And when you ask, where do we go from here? It's incredibly sad, but I don't know how he would handle America today. You look at something like the murder of George Floyd, and I remember Michelle Obama was on a show and she said, I just feel weary. I just feel spent. And so people of color feel that way. And for someone like Dr. King, I cannot imagine the level of frustration or how physically tired and emotionally tired he would feel. You know, Fannie Lou Hamer said, I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired. Well, he must have been really sick and really tired. And so if he were here, you know, which I can't imagine he would have any hope for the future of this country based on how little progress has been made and how little effort has been made to really make progress.
Is there a certain turn here to, and I don't know King's career well enough to address this, but there's so much wonderful material, and some of that is the social media material we've seen, as Renee was saying, that has to do with me. There's lots of individual message that comes from Dr. King. It seems to me that in this book, we're moving a little bit more to civil engagement and what is it that has to happen with a government. Is that a general shift as we get toward the end of his career?
I would argue, Martin, that that systemic racism has always been a part of Dr. King's trajectory. I mean, if you look at the Montgomery bus boycotts of '55, I mean, the Supreme Court had to come in and deal with that. If you look at Birmingham, you know, the Kennedys were very mindful of Birmingham, kept in touch with Dr. King and members of the civil rights movement. Again, we've talked to 64, 65 key pieces of legislation. And then if you look at the Great Society programs that Johnson was supportive of, that Dr. King really believed in, and of course, even in the book, I mean, he talks about some of these things, the universal basic income, a radical education program. That ties right into the idea that the federal government has got to take the lead in making the changes that Black people need. And, you know, I think it's very important that, particularly as African Americans, as we interact with our white counterparts, many times you can hear our white counterparts reflect what we might call an American liberalism, which is very individualistic. But as African Americans, we can see throughout our history in the United States that we've always had a great dependence and affection for the central state, in this case, the federal government, because the federal government is holding the scales of justice blindly. Federal government is open to the cause and the concern of Black folks. I was just saying earlier this afternoon, you know, while you have the federal government that is instituting Reconstruction, it's the state governments that want to institute Black codes. While the federal government is trying to produce civil rights legislation, it's the state governments is trying to uphold poll taxes and literacy tests. You know, while you have the federal government is trying to open up doors to try to do something with the Voting Rights Act instead of just allowing it just to die, you know, you've got state governments that are passing voter ID laws. So I would make the argument that Dr. King is very mindful of systemic racism and the need for the government to move.
Mm-hmm. Adam, can I ask a follow-up question really briefly, if you don't mind? When you look at something like a for-profit criminal justice system that unfairly, unequally targets Black men or men of color. How can you make people of all colors understand that a few people profit from that, but as taxpayers, we all bear the burden of that systemic racism? How do you make people understand that moving forward would benefit us all, not just Black people? You're going to have less people incarcerated unfairly, but as taxpayers, we don't bear the burden of making a few people wealthy when they with this mass incarceration of Black people. How do you make people understand that?
Tommy, I have to admit, I don't know if it can be understood if there is a criminal justice system that works for some and is woefully negligent in working for others. So if now maybe if we get into conversations about poor, lower income white individuals, maybe we could have a conversation about trying to convince people to understand. But if we have a criminal justice system that seems to work for some at the exclusion of others, I don't really know if you can have a healthy conversation about the disproportionately negative impact of the criminal justice system on Black and brown people. I don't know if we can get there. Unless we see a degree of, again, systemic change as to how we look at the system.
Mm-hmm. To jump ahead, I'm only just as a brief moment to the end. One of the things that I find so refreshing about the book, and looking at systemic change and big problems, is that King doesn't fit into a neat or tidy ideological camp. And I like that so much. That end section where he's saying capitalism gets this right and gets this wrong, communism gets this right and this wrong. And what he's coming at is something that is not prepackaged. I would say it's prophetic. That this is something that is not easily put into a pigeonhole, which seems to me so contemporary. We have put everybody into these ideological boxes that don't even necessarily make sense. And I think that's a refreshing feature of the book. I know it came out of a moment for him of deep frustration. It must have.
Well, and I think Martin, so much of our difficulty and our challenge is that people can't look beyond those pigeonholes that you're talking about. And so you don't have these conversations where people talk about 2 or 3 facets of one thing and 2 or 3 facets of another, and how they might be good and bad, and how they could interact to create something even better. I mean, it's so difficult to get people to have these uncomfortable conversations. And, that's especially true within the white community, probably, is people aren't, they just get so uncomfortable and then they freeze sometimes. But being able to look beyond it would be so helpful.
Yeah, I think there's the tendency to put Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. into the love box, the love and the peace box, but he was so much more than that. And people aren't comfortable with the other side there, but they do like we can romanticize with all the quotes and he's saying the right things, but then there's a piece of him too, where he deals with some issues that we're facing in this country. And people don't necessarily, like Renee said, feel comfortable going there.
Well, and I think also that, it is disheartening to see so many things have not changed and are the same, but I am heartened by the fact, and again, I'm going to go back to social media. I spend a lot of my job on social media, so I'm very, very much immersed in it, but there's so many young activists out there who are using that platform really well, I think, to do more than just put up quotes or put up sound bites, but to actually create learning courses and discussion groups and moments where people are, at least the people who are comfortable. I mean, obviously it'd be great if everyone was doing it, but that at least there are some of these conversations happening. And that does make me feel a little hopeful to see that that is happening in various ways.
Yeah, I think Dr. King would be very proud of the young advocacy that's out there now. And I haven't seen that level of advocacy since the civil rights movement, really, whenever you think about it. So there's been a huge gap. So I think he would feel good about that.
That's good. if we take that simplistic and we move away from that simplistic idea that it's all just love, with King, we can move into the content of the book a bit. And I think Reverend Ward's been in and out technically. I don't know if you're with us or not. I wonder if you could introduce for us the themes that you identified as the kind of three big themes through the book, and kind of unpack those a little bit for us. Or he may not be able to. Let me throw that out to anybody while we see if we can get the technical stuff arranged at the summit. The three themes that were identified were wisdom and courage and power. So how would you all find those themes woven through this book, and what insight is there and what contemporary relevance?
Well, very quickly, I think the wisdom of Dr. King is to look at 1967 and the condition of America, and more particularly the condition of African Americans. The wisdom to talk about how Black people now need to move in this post-segregation, post-Civil Rights Act environment. And I think that Dr. King right now, even at 38 years old, is very much, the wise griot, if not the father of Black America at this time. And that's a heavy, heavy burden to think about. So I think that he is speaking through great wisdom, even though he's still a young man. Yeah. I think Bryant said that when they did the autopsy on Dr. King, said even though he was 39 years old, he had the heart of a 60-plus-year-old man because of the wear and the strain. So I think that's indicative of his wisdom. It took great courage, I think, to go against a government that now we know about a J. Edgar Hoover, COINTELPRO government. This idea of being wiretapped, being followed, having people in your crew that we find out some now 50 years later were actually government informants. It took great courage to say that the American government is wrong. And I think lastly, the power is at the very end when you begin to see Dr. King talk about power. And Tommy alluded to this a few seconds ago, that he'll never come out and say, I'm pro-Black power. And God knows Stokely Carmichael was pushing him every time about saying about Black power. But you begin to see where Dr. King says we need to utilize our power. Maybe in the context of a rainbow coalition, we need to, align with the Puerto Rican community, align with Asian Americans. We need to understand that we do have a collective bond. So when I saw those three things, those are things that came to me.
Yeah, I think sort of for me, looking through the book, I saw some moments where I saw power written about, and I saw some moments where wisdom was sort of touched on. But for me, I see courage just in his life. I mean, the first book I ever checked out of the Bristol Public Library was the Autobiography of Dr. Martin Luther King. Before I could drive a car, my mother drove me to the library, and that's the first book that I checked out. Now, we all study the founding fathers, and as a historian, Martin, the story of America. But there's a Native American proverb that says it's easy to be brave from a distance. And so you can say whatever you want about a tyrannical king when he's half a world away. But just imagine that you are a person of color, and every time you walk out of your house, someone wants to kill you, not for anything that you've done against the government, but for the color of your skin and for fighting for equality. Let's not forget, when he went to Washington, it was the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. That's what he wanted to fight for. A person who did not need to, because if you read about his life, they say Daddy King never once financed a car in his life. His father paid cash for every car he ever owned. Martin Luther King was upper middle class. And so he took on this fight that he didn't have to take on. And he was vilified just because he wanted Black people to be equal. They wanted to kill him for fighting for that. And I feel as if, in terms of history, even though we have this day to commemorate his life, it still sort of doesn't really give you an idea of the courage that he had to walk outside of his house every day and be vilified for fighting for freedom. And then when he died in Memphis, he was there for sanitation workers because he felt they were disenfranchised. Now, every time I think about his life, I go back to biblical text because it seems like that's the only real connection I can make. You take a person who is the Son of God and has no reason to do it, but he says, because you have done these things, I will sacrifice my life for you. I can't think of anyone else in American history who comes close to the courage that he had every single day of his life. And I'm just impressed by that. As the older I get, please don't tell them how not. But the older I get, I'm just more impressed by it because it's not an easy thing to be hated, and to be hated for something as simple as these people, these sanitation workers should have equal pay and equal rights and be treated more fairly is astounding to me. It's just an astounding amount of courage that he had in his body every single day of his life without reason. He did not have to take on this fight. He just felt compelled to do it.
It's good to see you. So what do you want to tell us about courage, wisdom, power?
Courage, wisdom, power. Can you hear me pretty well?
We can hear you. We got you.
Praise the Lord. Amen. Wisdom, courage, power. One of the reasons why I believe that this particular book presents for us wisdom, courage, and power, because I have to think of myself as, for me, the number one reason being a part of this culture and being an emerging leader, particularly the leader of a generation of young people, a generation of new people growing up, and a new leader in the church, I needed an opportunity to find out what I was seeking this book for. I was seeking this book for wisdom. My idea was, in the midst of everything that was happening, I knew exactly what my mentors or what my fathers in the ministry in that particular time would say that, but they had passed. And so I was dealing with my own personal period of who could I speak to, but the only thing that I knew that I was going through, that the only thing that I had left was what they wrote, what they gave to me. And so I had to look for them, and I had to look for wisdom. And looking in this particular for wisdom, I find out that even in the midst of reading this, particularly when we talked about Black power and having a person when you're feeling so aggravated and you want to do something and you don't want to do something that's of the old, and you have this vitality in this order, you don't understand what's happening. You needed wisdom. And that was the situation when we were talking about Black power and freedom now. You need someone, you need the elders, you need someone to tell you there's another way approach that we need to get to it. And sometimes having that discontent, sometimes we can be so arrogant or so adamant to say that was y'all time, but it's our times now. But the wisdom is what we needed, because there's sometimes we may be able to use something, but if we can't make effective change, then that's something that's to happen. But it's also, what I love about Dr. King is he was able to take the frustrations of the frustrations of what we was feeling and articulate it in such a way where we could understand it and understand that whatever movement we need to be a part of, I need to come to a conversation and say we need to have the courage not to be silenced. Because what happens is when we move and they tell you not to do something, it's just like we're just trying to shut you up and silence you because we don't want to fit the situation. But until he had to talk about, until we got uncomfortable, until it started dealing with money, until it started dealing with the actual reality of what was happening, then you have to have the courage to have it. And that's what prophetic ministry was about. That's why we always say, we talk about Dr. King, but we know that he was a theologian. He was scholarly, and he had to have the courage to speak on behalf of the people. But the power that he had was not just the power to just say assume power. It was the power of his faith and the power, you have to say, beyond him, because anyone could be as threatened as he was or as the people was, and know that you're threatened for your life, but then to still speak, knowing that maybe this may be your last day, maybe you could be killed earlier, maybe your family may be attacked. But what happens, he still had to go in the power of what he feels it was the Holy Spirit and the empower of the Holy Spirit of God to say that this is a mission that we have to do it, and for right is right, and we have to do it with love. And so the message has to be done by any means necessary. And I believe the wisdom, the courage is the power, is exactly what he had already spoken. We can still use 50 years later. So if it wasn't powerful, then we wouldn't be able to take the tools that we have to even talk about why we have riots, why we have the white backlash, what is racism, what do we have to do now? And if we had not had it, we would not know. When we talked about the fear urgency is now, we see it right now.
It's funny that and those themes I think come through so much more strongly for us reading it now because we know April 4th the next year. And it gives this book a kind of tragic edge, but also really noble, really powerful and amazing to know that that's coming down the line. Well, I'm curious, are there, as we turn to think a little bit about how this book becomes for us the voice of the elders talking to us now, speaking to us in 2021 after the year we've just had, and trying to find our feet a little bit as a society, trying to find community instead of chaos. I'd be curious in how you all would unpack that. Is this a message that is ultimately hopeful? How practical is it? What do you glean from this book thinking about the future?
So I see it as very practical, Martin. When we were talking about wisdom, courage, and power, whenever I looked at wisdom, Dr. King knew that people were going to get weary, that this was going to be a tough fight. And it wasn't something that was going to happen overnight. This is something that every generation will take on. And he had a quote in the book that I thought was particularly powerful for me. And it's kind of explaining what this journey would look like. And he says, first, the line of progress is never straight. For a period, a movement may follow a straight line and then it encounters obstacles and the path bends. It is like curving around a mountain when you are approaching a city. Often it feels as though you were moving backward and you lose sight of your goal, but in fact, you're moving ahead and soon you will see the city again. So he knew that there would be opposition, there would be success, and right behind that success, you're going to have that backlash. So that helped me. That gave me some understanding. It's like, okay, what is going on here? Because I'm thinking, my parents grew up in the civil rights movement. They're, for them, it's just unbelievable that, we're going backwards. It feels like going backwards for them. But to hear this from Dr. King, I mean, he's saying, it's not going to be a straight line. It's going to be winding. So, and it's going to look like you're going backwards, but you're really moving forward. And then whenever you have a success, expect that there will be some backlash behind it. So it was helpful wisdom for today and relevant for me.
I would like to say, just admiring just the quote again, that's what I was going to go to. It was very, very similar. Because the reason why this is very practical for me is because it's almost as if Dr. King is speaking to us. There's a particular part, and he says, and if this doesn't sound like what we just experienced, nothing will. And he says that it's almost like someone has to be the moral conscience of the country. And sometimes we can't lose it. And it says, are we more concerned with the size, power, and wealth of our society, or with creating a more just society? The failure to pursue justice is not only a moral default, but without it, social tensions will grow and the turbulence in the streets will persist despite disapproval or repressive action. Even more, a withered sense of justice in an expanding society leads to corruption of the lives of all Americans. And all too many of those who live in affluent America ignore those who exist in poor America. But in doing so, the affluent Americans will eventually have to face themselves with the question that Ackerman choose to ignore. How responsible am I for the well-being of my fellows? For to ignore evil is to become an accomplice to it. What we cannot we cannot go by and simply ignore evil when we know that it's causing corruption to not just one set of people, but to all people. And what we have to be reminded as as we're reminded to us, we need to remind it in whatever aspect that we have. We need each one of our professions. We need each one of our cultures, us in the faith community, us in the education community, us who we continue. I don't know if we're supposed to be, because I'm supposed to say us. I don't know if that sounds country, but I don't know. But I'm just saying, just all of us, when we do museums to teach the history, to show history, those who are out of those, there's one thing to be uniform, but uniformity is different. We have one goal that we have to achieve, but we all have different ways to achieve that. And so when we do that, it reminds us that each one of our roles are very important, because we're trying to achieve the same goal. And that is, we cannot live in evil, but we must live in love. And love still rules. Love still reigns. And love is the answer that we need to come together. And sometimes we have to be exposed to evil so that we can recognize when love is most important. And so I believe that not only this is a practical stance for all of us, but I believe it gives each and every one of us hope to be entrusted that whatever we're gifted in, whether it's education, whether it's history, whether it's advocacy, whatever we are, it allows us to find our place in the narrative and be a part of the work. And it doesn't matter the color of your skin. It doesn't matter the color of your heart. You just got to have the same color. And that's the color of red. And that's the color of love. And that's what we have to work together. And if we're reminded of that, then we can use our gifts to make sure we can do that. So I believe that that's where we are today. And that's why it's needed as a practical guide to get to that place, to be reminded that that's what we have to do to work.
Martin, if we have just a little bit of time, I completely agree with Pastor Ward. Completely agree with Pastor Ward. I hope that what I say doesn't come as a sharp rejection of his argument, because again, I do believe that we do need to work together as brothers and sisters, crossing all particular lines. But I do believe when you look at the book, you are seeing a man in Martin King who is embracing his blackness. And being pro-black is not necessarily anti-white. There is a need, and I think Martin King I think he's alluding to this, for black people to understand who they are as black people. And again, I think that that's another thing, because when we think about Martin King, we want to think about the great unifier. We want to think about, the individual who talks about the little boys and the little girls sitting together at the table. We want to think about Letter from a Birmingham Jail. We really want to think about this unifying figure. But there is something to be said about an individual in Dr. King who says he wants black people to understand that they are somebody. You are somebody, and Reverend Jackson is going to pick that up, and he'll do that exchange. I am somebody, red and yellow, black and white. We're all precious in his sight. Dr. King's going to spend some time talking about black people need to understand, whether you have good hair or curly hair or no hair, the fact that, that we are somebody, and we've got to find our identity. Black people, we are still struggling. Even in 2021, this is the practicality, I think, of Dr. King's book and the prophetic voice and eye of Dr. King's book. In 2021, we are still struggling because we do not trust each other. We don't have a group identity. We don't have this sense of somebodyness. And it really hurts the heart when you look at the current push for rights and justice, and you begin to see slight stumbles and trips with some of our young people, because they weren't necessarily rooted in the theory of nonviolent tradition. They knew that they wanted to accomplish something, but they didn't really understand all of the contours and the particulars thereof. So Dr. King, I think the practicality that I would glean, Dr. King was really trying to talk to black people about the worth of being black, and how we have got to find some way to coalesce so that when we wish to push an agenda, it's not out of hatred. And Pastor Ward, I think, articulated it so clear. It's out of love, but this radical agenda has got to move forward. But we've got to be solid in getting it across. It hurts the feelings. It hurts my feelings to see young people trying to say that we need to move forward on rights. And then you've got some saying, well, why are you out there doing it? You know, why are you out there doing that? You know, you shouldn't be out there doing that. There's another way. And Brother Ward brought it out, you know, that there are elders in our community, but we don't understand, or at least we struggle with solidarity. And Dr. King is talking about that in the book.
Martin,
But I just want to bring this particular point. I don't disagree with you, but I really want to say that part of it is that you are definitely right, that one of the things that we have to get together first, if we as the African American community, we first have to have the agenda first. It's almost, how can you ask someone to help you if you don't know what you need help with?
Yeah.
And see, and one of the issues is that you're right. When he talked about somebodyness, he's now allowing us, now that we've been scholars, now that we have the opportunities, he is really telling us that we have to be responsible of getting that word out. We have to be responsible to take back what has been tried to be indoctrinated into the minds through institutions. And we need to reclaim our own. We need to teach our own children. We need to pass that information. And there's nothing against anybody else that we don't have to see, but we do have to. If you're talking about being as a value of the Black man, the Black young men and young women, we have to have conversations that our biracial people don't have to have. We have to have those things, that we have to come together, but we also need to come together where the elders have to say, all right, I know you're fighting, but this is how you fight. And then it's almost like when you ride on the airplane, what do they tell you? If you're riding with a minor, what's to happen? The first thing they tell you to do when the thing come down and the oxygen mask come, it says, first of all, if you're traveling with a minor, if you're the adult, first put the mask on yourself first, and then try to help the one who's the minor, because if you can't try to help anybody else if you about to pass out, die as well. And so you're right. Not only do we have to find out how to save ourselves, but we also have to save ourselves, because if you think about it, when we're looking at a movement for one person, it affected all. It wasn't just they saw little kids, and when we think about it, I grew up in Birmingham, Alabama, and it wasn't until you saw the children being beaten. It wasn't until you saw the girls dying from the burning from the burning church. It wasn't until you saw the dogs being licked on children that people got to say, now something's got to be wrong with this. That doesn't have to do with color. That has to do with humanity. But we have to do both and. We also got to realize, as a people, we just can't do it by ourselves as well. We have to have allies. We have to have people to talk to the racism, and other people have to say, no, we are wrong. There is white privilege, and no, there is happening. So which means that Dr. King was, as much as we talked about empowering ourselves, he also says we can't do it by ourselves. There have to be allies who got to have the same courage and the wisdom to speak against it as well. Not to just say oh, they're still great citizens. But if we was able to do what we had to do in Washington, D.C., and I live in Maryland, and I promise you, I would, if I had to try to get even on the basement floor of the Capitol, I'd be shot dead as a Black man today in 2021. So we gotta see, we cannot erase what's happening. We gotta see what it is for real. But when we address it, there's no more scars. There's no more turning the paint around. But what we have to be to a place when we go from here is that what will happen if we don't heed the words? And so we don't want to go backwards. We're going forward. And if nobody else can say it, check this. If you read Barack Obama's book, A Promised Land, guess where he got the promised land from? Dr. King. Because it's still saying that there is still hope. There's a promised land that's been attached, and we still can get there. We haven't gotten there yet, but we are still able to get there.
Tommy, I think you were coming in.
Yeah, I was going to say something related to what Adam was saying, only because I just sort of feel like it's just a minor point. I feel like one of the things I wanted to touch on was when you look at chaos and community. I think he picked that subtitle on purpose because he was supposed to have this really harsh relationship with Malcolm X, and Malcolm X gave the speech, The Ballad of the Bullet. He wasn't advocating violence. He was just saying that if you disenfranchise the people for a certain length of time, they will react. And that's, I think, what Dr. King was trying to say. And also, I just wanted to touch on a book written by Dr. Cornel West called Race Matters. And in that book, he said the obstacles to student success, Black student success, are structural and behavioral. He's not excusing Black people from being responsible. He's just saying that we have to be responsible, so then when the structures change, and they have to change, we'll be ready. And so I feel like it's a two-pronged approach we really need here. To look at education differently in our community, but then to argue that you can't send our kids to failure factories and expect them to succeed. It's just really an excuse to give them a poor education so you can keep these for-profit prisons full, like in Virginia. So I think it's, you said this at the beginning, and you've sort of focused on it even more as we've gone along. It just doesn't fit into an easy category. But our approach can be simple. We have to fight against those structures that continue to disenfranchise us, while at the same time informing our community that education is important and making certain that they're prepared when they get to those levels of education that are blocking them.
Thinking about education, Renee, makes me think about your work at the museum, and I'm curious how you see your work fitting into a kind of going forward with Dr. King's book here.
You know, in a couple of ways, really. I mean, it's interesting because I think 2 or 3 of us now have mentioned the somebodyness term that Dr. King used, and I had written that down actually specifically in relation to public history. And I think that's because museums have a role to tell stories and to tell these histories. And that is something that they have done well and also imperfectly in the past. But I think that representation matters, and there is a movement in museums and in cultural organizations, in historic sites, to really take that seriously, that representation matters. And so you see places like plantation sites who are now not just telling the stories of the white slave owners in the big house, they're telling the stories of the enslaved population. And they're often facing pushback for that. I mean, there's some really sad and disturbing stories of visitors who've pushed back on hearing that because they don't want to be uncomfortable, and they want to have the romantic view of what that place was like. But also, you know, there's a lot of talk in the museum community about how important it is, like if you're telling the story of a community, you know, of people of color or indigenous peoples, to actually involve them in telling their own story, to invite them to be community curators, to invite them to share their oral histories, to invite them to give you advice and ideas of how to do that particular program or to do that particular exhibit. And so I think public history has an important role in this. And like I said, it's something it's not perfect. It's an imperfect thing that's happening, but I think it's encouraging to see that movement. And it's not something that's only, this conversation is not something that I've seen just in the last year. This is a conversation that was happening before that, which also encourages me that it wasn't just a reaction. I mean, it probably was a reaction ultimately, but it wasn't just a reaction to this particular year, that it's something that's built and that now has conferences and conversations about it quite seriously. And I think also that museums and cultural organizations, you know, they're becoming repositories for some of this challenging history so that it can be told with context instead of without. And I'm thinking in particular about Civil War monuments, for instance, where quite a few of those, when they've been taken down, aren't just being trashed, they're being moved into museums so that the story of when they were put up, why they were put up, what was being represented there, why it was being done is being told. And I think that's so important because for years, them not having that context has been problematic. But also that museums are collecting for what is happening in our communities now. So over the last year, museums have been collecting for COVID-19. They've been collecting for the Black Lives Matter and the social justice demonstrations. The Smithsonian has started collecting immediately after January 6th about what happened there. It's so important for these institutions to carry that history forward. And, you know, museums and libraries are reckoned to be the most trusted sources of information to most people. And so taking that responsibility seriously is important.
I want to go ahead and say, anybody who's watching, we'll have some time for questions. So if you want to put those in the comments on Facebook Live, I'll be happy to present those to the panelists for you. And while I give people a minute to do that, let me ask you five panelists. We have that great image that Tina mentioned, the image of driving up a hill where sometimes you can see the city and sometimes you can't. What parts of the city do you see, and where is it hard to see?
You're putting us into metaphors and stuff, Martin. That's
I
hard.
am. I have that privilege as the chair.
Can we see the maybe 7 or 8 years ago, I wrote a play called Level to the Ground, and it was selected for the Henry Edmonds New Works Festival in Washington, D.C. And I'd never been to Washington, D.C. before in my life, sadly. And as I was driving toward Washington, D.C., I was talking to my friend Carl on the phone, who lives in Atlanta. And I said, yeah, it's tonight at, oh my God, because I could see the Washington Monument in the distance. And it's so large and impressive. I think we're at that point where we can see some things, just the shapes. And as we get closer, they'll start to take form more. But I think just seeing that in the distance made this impression on me. It's almost, again, I don't want to step on toes by going back to biblical references, but the woman who says, if I can just touch the hem of his garment, then I will be healed. I don't have to see him. You don't have to bring me in front of him. It's just, so I think we can see that. I mean, the election of Barack Obama, I have students who for half their lives had an African-American president. Phenomenal. And now we have Kamala Harris, the first person of color who's vice president, female. And it's incredibly encouraging. But you still live in a society where day to day, you see these affronts to humanity, because I don't feel like it just affects Black people. I don't know if you ever read the book 12 Years a Slave, or if you saw Steve McQueen's incredible film adaptation. When you take a whip and you beat another human being, I have to think that it scars you for life. You're never the same person again. And I feel like people who have disenfranchised people of color don't really understand the damage that it's doing to them and to their children and to their friends and neighbors. And so I really feel like this movement forward, when we see these things in the distance, we should both be looking for those things in the distance, because it's going to be trouble for people who feel comfortable with the way Black people are treated. If that is truly how you feel, I question your humanity. I question your humanity if you feel comfortable with what's happening to Black people. And moving forward, how do you reconcile with that? How do you come to terms with that? I'm just sort of puzzled by that aspect.
So for me, whenever I look at the city, I think we're all on this panel today, we're part of that city. So the fact that we're even here today having the conversation is important. But whenever I look at, okay, well, what are some opportunities that are still out there for us? I think about, racism. I think about the pandemic. I think about the disproportionate number of Black and brown people who have been impacted by COVID-19. I look at healthcare disparities. I look at the criminal justice system. So there are still opportunities. I look at poverty, and poverty is not just a Black issue, it's a white issue as well. So, poverty is still a huge factor. And then just the violence of even what occurred on January the 6th and the rise of white nationalism. So yes, I see a glimpse of the city. I see that there are some great things that are going on. I see that we're having this conversation, but at the same time, there are some other things that I see as well. But I'm hopeful. I stay hopeful.
To follow on, what we have a listener question about healthcare specifically, which really brings us into a particular bit of contemporary relevance. What about any thoughts about specific steps that communities who are desperate for healthcare can take or need to have done, especially in light of the COVID-19 crisis? How do we improve those inequities? How do we make that better?
One thought, and again, this is a matter of perspective. If you believe in systemic racism, if you believe that there's a wealth gap, individuals who have better paying jobs will probably be able to access better health care, so that when these situations occur, at least they have some kind of coverage. So we could at least ensure that people have access to decent paying jobs, and people are trained, and people are able to really be part of the current day workforce. If you think about it, many of the individuals that worked in essential, many of the individuals who were essential workers, a good number of those folks were Black and brown people. You think about the fact that a scary thought that kind of dwells in the back of my mind is that some employers may take lessons learned from COVID-19 and really direct their eyes to automation. And if that's the case, then now you've got a crowd of people that's now out of the workforce because of automation. And now when sickness comes, they won't have decent health care. So I think that there's something to be said there about employment. Good employment, decent employment is access to decent benefits, which again would impact their health care.
And Adam, I touched on something you said earlier. Again, I see you have these great points that I keep wanting to sort of touch base on. Is that if you look at states like Kentucky and Tennessee, where people who are under the poverty line have less access to health care, there are states that overwhelmingly vote for people who keep them away from good health care. Sadly, when our current president was elected, people in Kentucky were great, that they were so grateful that he was elected, and they wanted to get rid of Obamacare. And then they found out that the Affordable Health Care Act and Obamacare were the same thing. They didn't know that. And so how, like, as I said earlier to you, how then do you inform people to make them aware that you are voting against your own best interest without just cause? Same thing for Tennessee. A friend of mine, Gail, told me that she read an article that 70% of the people in Tennessee are obese or overweight, and they have less access to health care, and they continue to vote for those individuals who want them to have no health care. It just seems, again, if they were more informed, perhaps they would, but I would hope that they would then try to secure their own futures in some way. I'm just sort of puzzled by that.
I think, Tommy, I think some of it is also that there's charged words used in all of these conversations. Words that immediately make people turn off from listening. And I lived in England for 20 years under the national health system, which universal health care, socialized medicine, whatever you want to call it. But some of those words, immediately when you use them, people react to them. And instead of like thinking about it in a logical, rational way and say, here's how it would work, here's the benefits, here's how we would implement it, it becomes so politicized, which is a shame, because I really miss the NHS. I feel like, there's wonderful healthcare in this country, but the stress of healthcare in this country is, just alone the stress that's added to getting healthcare and understanding the system and figuring out your insurance and all those things just sort of get on top of you. And I just think that getting away from those charged words, getting people to actually have real conversations where it's not about politicizing it, is so much part of the solution. It's not the whole solution, but it's definitely something that needs to happen.
And Renee, of course, she framed it, I think, nicely. The charged words. The charged words, of course, are used. And I would say that this is when we racialize things. So like in our conversation this evening, you know, we have made, I think very real points about, you know, poverty is not just Black. Some of the problems that we face are just not Black issues. But the sad reality is that in our society, we have racialized things. And so I really think that there's a need for us to, I think now it's a pressing need to say that, you know, yes, there is poverty. Yes, there is health disparities. Yes, there are, you know, educational disparities. And yes, they do go beyond race. But the sad reality is that we have put race, we have allowed race to blend into these issues. And until we are willing to talk about specifically the racial impacts of these issues, we're going to continue to have them. And it goes back to, I think, a comment that, or the point that Tommy was making, that, you know, why are people voting against their interests? Well, because again, we have, again, the dog whistle of race. And I mean, that goes back almost 50 some years. I mean, it's just fused in our elections. And many times in my class, I use the story of Bob Ewell and To Kill a Mockingbird. You know, I think Harper B. said he lived next to the trash dump, which was an indication of who Bob Ewell was. Everybody knew that Bob Ewell was the lowest of the low, but compared to Tom Robinson, Bob Ewell was somebody. And so we have racialized things to such a degree that that the individuals will vote against their interests if we think that the welfare queen is going to get an opportunity, if we think that entitlements are going to them, if we think that so we have racialized things. And so we've got to, I believe, in the 21st century, have serious conversations about how systemic racism exists, how it is fused into our whole political identity. And the political identity, whether we want to admit it or not, the political identity is really the identity of the United States of America.
And even the film Norma Ray, if you've seen Norma Ray, she's a woman who's trying to get a union in her factory. One of the ways they stop the union, Adam, is to say, well, you know that Black workers will make the same as you if there's a union. And, well, oh no, we don't want that. And so
I also think we also need to think about the racial, not even just racial disparities, but just in our health pandemic right now. I have concern for the elderly. I have concern for so many of those who now have a vaccine and that they have to be at a certain place at a certain time, but they hear about it only in certain counties, in certain places, and they're not able to get it and they don't have enough. And so how do we be able to distribute if they even have it? And then if they even have to get a rapid shot, or if they can't go into a place, then they ask them for their insurance. And then if they don't have insurance, then how are they going to be able to get the proper health care? And there's so many people that we're trying to keep our elderly who already have pre-existing conditions. And we can't. And how do we have opportunities to have mobile labs or things in our community to address so that there's equality for everyone to have access? Some people may not be able to drive all the way to Johnson City but they have the hospital for children that they was there. So, or they have things that's there that other people or the surrounding communities may not have. So the best place to go is because that's where it is. But if we know that we have opportunity, we just have to create a space that each and everyone have the same opportunities, whether there's healthcare, whether there's getting their shots, whether there's opportunity. We have to set them up where we can have to come together as a community to make sure that we have enough and it's also equally distributed, and that we can take care of those who may not be able to come, but that we can provide access for those who can.
And even those who are disproportionately impacted, what are we doing to prioritize those?
We have a number of great comments on the string, and I encourage everybody to look at those at some point. I'm going to be a little selective with what I bring in, but one is, if you had a minute, sit down with the president and vice president-elect, and you had this book in your hand, what would be your short version of the message for the incoming administration?
I would say your getting elected is step one of a long process, and keep moving forward. Don't lose hope. Don't, if you feel your strength start to fail, drink a Red Bull. But there's so much that has to be done in these 4 years simply to overturn some of the, listen, during the first 90 days of the current president's administration, he got rid of the pandemic office that President Barack Obama had set up. And you look at all these offices that have not been filled, these positions that haven't been filled in the past 4 years. Just the business of running a government has been sort of ignored. And they've got lots of work to do on that front, as well as trying to move this nation, this really fractured, divided nation forward. It's not going to be easy. I don't feel for them, but I really feel that these two people are up to the task. I know that they're up to the task. What I think they need is our support in keeping them moving forward.
I think something else that is worth saying, and it's something that a lot of the other panelists have mentioned at some point within the conversation, is that by working to improve the lives and the hopes of different groups of people within our community, that we're building the entire community. It's not an either or proposition. It is something where improving other people's lives is going to improve all of our lives, and that they have to keep that in mind, because it's too easy to compromise. And sometimes the compromises are too much.
I think I would want them to read the book, but there is a focus that Dr. King has on people and things. The reason why you were elected was because of people, and these are the people that you represent. So let's not get it confused. I think that people versus things is really powerful, how we've moved away from our focus on people and more so on things.
Understand the political uplifting agenda in the book. I think that a radically different agenda that's very scary for American society. But I think that I would want the president and vice president to see some of the focus again on education, some of the focus on universal basic income, some of the focus that Dr. King is talking about in this shift, economic shift, that again is scary, but Dr. King was going there, particularly with the Poor People's Campaign. So understand the need to really provide for the least of these, and then also your global image in the world, and so how does the great United States, this strong leader of the world, of the free world, how will we be seen in today's light? So I think those are a couple of things I would want the president and vice president to pay attention to.
Mm-hmm.
And I definitely, not only I agree with Tina that I definitely would love for them to not only read the book, but they are as close to the statue as anybody. It's only a couple of blocks. And I hope that, when I hope they reminded, when they're reminded and they read the book and they see the statue, I hope they remember that when they see the statue and they notice that, and on the statue, on the monument of Dr. King, that there are no feet, because I hope it reminds them that there was a lot of people who had to go to the polls. There was a lot of people who had to vote. And even though they didn't vote, but those people who did vote, I want them to not just play the political game of just say something and not do what they say. I hope that for every promise or for everything that they say that they were going to do, I hope that they stay true to their word, because it'd be very, very upsetting that we've already gone through such a horrible time, and for them to not recognize exactly what really happened and how you were able to get to that position and not be true to your word. And so I want to say that for everything that if you try and that's your hope and whatever your mission, and I hope that we'll also stay accountable, and I also we hope we stay involved. But I really, really and truly let them know that right now it's almost going to take so much to just, it's almost like being in the negative. You got to, we've been so into negative that we have to achieve just to get back at zero. But promise us that we will do everything that they say that will happen, and that they won't give up, all because they believe in the hope that they have to have. And if they stay true to what it is, and they do what they say they're going to do, and not be hypocrites, but truly do what they say they're going to do and lead this country to the place where we know we can do it, I believe to win the hearts of the people is going to be known by their actions more than their words. So I hope they keep their word.
Community as opposed to chaos, I suppose, in all 5 of your cases. This is what you're advocating, and certainly what Dr. King was. I had another comment, brings up something I want to move toward closing in a few minutes, but I mean, I could talk to you all indefinitely. But one of our commentators mentioned John Lewis, who of course passed not very long ago, is a great champion of nonviolence. Thanks to a book club I'm in with Renee, and thanks to the generosity of Tommy, I got to read the 3-volume set called March, the graphic novel of John Lewis's life. And it turns on its head, and I think in a way that is very consonant, to pick up on some things Tommy said already, very much consonant with the Christian gospel, the idea of power. That power is expressed in my giving power to other people and my giving of myself. This is what shows real power. And to see those images, not just to read the words, but to see that graphic novel with the images of a man willing to be beaten and willing to be spat upon and willing to be put in jail, willing to have his life at risk over and over and over again, it just brought that home to me in such a powerful, powerful way. So I think that was an important book for me to read. And I had, I had some sense of this, but it just gave it so much flesh. It put a lot of reality into that storytelling. So following that, he's curious, who else would you recommend we be reading? Here's a book from 53 years ago that still has a lot of relevance, and I hope everybody who's watching would pick up a copy. What else would you advocate us to be reading or watching or listening to?
Martin, if you're willing to go back far enough, I would encourage everyone, because it's a really quick read, to read the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, a slave. Because in the very first chapter, he sort of sets the tone for America. He says, I don't know exactly when my birthday is. I don't know who my father is, but it's reported that my master was my father. We live in a country where the founding fathers decided to make a rule that the child shall follow the condition of the mother. So when they brutally raped slaves, they could profit from it. And when you look at that as the beginning, you don't find it really difficult to see where we are now. I mean, it's one of the most eloquent things I think I've ever read. That just the first chapter, where he talks about, I don't know who my father was, but it was reported that my master was my father. And the second thing I would encourage everybody, because it's a really, I think it's only about 90 minutes, but when you talk about a visceral visual image, Spike Lee did a documentary called 4 Little Girls that's incredible. Now, I would not recommend it for everybody, because toward the end, when they get to the actual church bombing, they do show some images of the girls on tables as they were, in the coroner's office. But it really sort of humanizes in such a profound way these 4 little girls. They were just little girls. I mean, they were young girls who had sisters and cousins and mothers and fathers who loved them dearly. And they were just going to church on a Sunday morning, and this bomb exploded. It's one of Spike Lee's more underrated and underappreciated projects, but it's really profound.
Good options. 2 very good options.
Other thoughts?
But there's a couple of books that just in the mind of what we've been studying and trying to find out more, and particularly for young adults readers and next generation, just to get people to get involved. There's one popular book that one of my students brought to me, was called How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Fende. And there was another book by the name Right Fragility that speaks to just the different perspectives of the lives and the conversations to have. And we know that there have been so many uncomfortable conversations that are very critical, but I believe by having the conversations, those two books have really sparked the conversation that all of us are having, and that we are not only just having the conversations, but finding not only where do we go to do next, but how do we do it now? And so I believe those two have been very, very popular. And a lot of groups are speaking about those, and there's a lot of people are really reading those particular books, and I think that will be help not only our conversation, but give us a practical guide to what we do next as well.
And I think, history books and nonfiction, there's so much out there, but I'm a big reader. I'm in that book club with you, Martin, but I would say that fiction sometimes helps us to understand things in a different way too. And two books that I read last year that really had an impact on me were Octavia Butler's Kindred, which I have both in normal book form and in graphic novel form, and also Colson Whitehead's The Nickel Boys, both of which I just think sometimes the storytelling in fiction can sort of give you that history in a different way, but in a very sort of immediate and visceral way. And so I would recommend those.
Two books that come to my mind, Souls of Black Folk by W.B. Du Bois. I've always enjoyed that book because you see just how sharp of a writer Dr. Du Bois is. Dr. Du Bois is going to give the thought for the race. And even though he is so disconnected with Black people, but yet he's going to give the thought process for the race. He's so intelligent, so articulate. And as he talks about the veil and how Black people are on the one side of the veil, and of course, and we know the religious language interwoven with the veil. The whole book has that religious overtone. And then here just recently, I read Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates. And Mr. Coates makes you aware of the fact that he does not align with Christian teaching, but yet still the parallels between Dr. Du Bois, who is certainly using biblical overtones, and Ta-Nehisi Coates, who is just talking about the body, our bodies being, in a sense, are the source of our being. To me, was just the parallels there were so sharp. And if I ever got the chance to sit with Mr. Coates, I would have to ask, what was the inspiration in writing that book? Because at least from as a practicing Christian, I could clearly understand where Dr. Du Bois is coming from as the Bible, using the Bible as kind of a reference point to make the case about the souls of Black folks and our spiritual yearnings and our spiritual strivings and such. But where did Mr. Coates come from? But yet still to have that same parallel was rich to me. But those would be the two books: Souls of Black Folks and Between the World and Me.
Okay. Tina, have you got a couple for us?
Yeah, for me, Jamar Tisby, The Color of Compromise, and he has a brand new book out, How to Fight Racism. So I have it right next to me. But he kind of looks at racism through the filter of Christianity. So I've been looking at that aspect of racism. And also James Cone said I wasn't going to tell nobody. Those are so those are two books that I'm reading right now.
Great.
Oh, and Tina, I just thought of one that we read together last year, not last year, 2019, I guess, The Warmth of Other Suns.
That was absolutely wonderful, about the Northern migration. That was wonderful. Mm-hmm.
Great. And several in the comments have added some other titles to that. Reading and conversation are so vital to our following Dr. King's vision and our trying to find that vision of the city. And it's been a great opportunity to share that with you all tonight. It is indeed what the entire mission of the King Institute is to create space for conversation and a space for thinking about the intersections of faith and culture more broadly. So I'm delighted to have had this opportunity with you all tonight. I want to thank each of you for your time and your expertise, for reading the book so carefully, and for bringing such thoughtful and useful responses for us. Thank you to those who have watched online. I greatly appreciate your time. And I hope that this has been as enriching for you as it is for me. One of the themes that we all talked about a little bit tonight in various ways is leadership. Leadership in times of crisis, leadership of people who need it. How is it that you find the voice of the oppressed and without coming in as somebody who's telling them what to do? How do you find the dynamic of leadership for the communities we've been talking about? And our speaker for next year, Natasha Sistrunk Robinson, has spent most of her career thinking about leadership. And so I want to finish in a minute with Natasha's little message for us for tonight and to move forward to next year. Anybody have a parting word for us before we move to the video?
And thank you, Martin, for bringing us all together.
Oh, it's a delight.
It was a pleasure and a privilege.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Well, thank you all for your time. Good. Well, next year we will have Natasha Robinson. I am going to finish with her video. Thank you all for watching. Stick around for just a second, and hopefully I will get the technology right and we can see Natasha. My name is Martin Dotterweich, and I direct the King Institute for Faith and Culture at King University in Bristol, Tennessee. Founded as the Buechner Institute for Faith and Culture in 2007, the King Institute has hosted an annual speaker series ever since, highlighting for our students and for our community people at the dynamic edge of Christian faith and cultural endeavor. As part of that annual series, it's been a delight to participate in the Twin Cities of Bristol, Tennessee, and Virginia's annual Martin Luther King Jr. celebration. We brought John Perkins 2 years ago, and last year, Father Gregory Boyle from Homeboy Industries in Los Angeles. This year, we were looking forward to a visit from Natasha Sistrunk Robinson, but that's been postponed owing to COVID. Ordinarily, we would have a speaker come in, participate at the train station, enjoy making new friends and sitting around tables before having a lecture in the evening. But this year we've had to put that off. Instead, we have an online roundtable discussion of Dr. King's last book. Where do we go from here? Chaos or community? But Natasha has kindly agreed to give us a little taste of what to anticipate next year when she comes to visit us. She's the president of T3 Leadership Solutions and brings to King over 20 years of experience in leadership and mentoring in the military and federal and academic and nonprofit sectors. She has a passion for raising up multi-generational and multi-ethnic leadership for a changing world. Natasha is a graduate of the United States Naval Academy. She was a captain in the United States Marine Corps, and she worked for the Department of Homeland Security. Following that, she did an MA in Christian leadership at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary in Charlotte, and she's gone on to be a prolific author. Among her publications are the books A Sojourner's Truth, Choosing Freedom and Courage in a Divided World, and Mentor for Life. With over 100 articles published, she is also the author of A Sista's Journey blog and the host of Sojourner's Truth, Conversations for a Changing Culture podcast. In her speaking and writing, Natasha focuses her passions for leadership, mentoring, discipleship, reconciliation, and justice. And she brings those to us in a short video clip today to help us think through the legacy and life of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Natasha is also involved with youth, trying to train up leaders for the next generation, for the common good of a world in need. And to that end, she serves as chairperson and visionary founder of the North Carolina-based nonprofit Leadership Links Incorporated. If you want to find out more about her writing, you can visit her website, www.natashasrobinson.com. And if you come join us next year, you'll meet her in person. So please join me in welcoming online to the King Institute, Natasha Sistrunk Robinson.
Brothers and sisters, next to Jesus, the Apostle Paul, and my beloved mother, no leader has influenced me more than the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I sung on the gospel choir for all 4 years that I attended the United States Naval Academy. And every year during this holiday, we would have the opportunity to go and sing at the historic Ebenezer Baptist Church, where both Dr. King and his father, Daddy King, served as pastors. It's on this sacred ground, the place where he and his wife are also buried, that I often felt connected to the struggle against anti-racism, against racial violence, and connected to the fight for freedom and justice for all. Connected to his belief that people of faith and goodwill, especially Christian people, could become the called out ones. The ones who will lead the rest of the world in embodying and proclaiming God's good news for his creation in the now and not yet kingdom, where Christ alone is king. In 2015, I attended a worship service during this holiday where Reverend Dr. Ralph Walnock, the senior pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church, and now the first Black senator to represent the state of Georgia, cautioned us against praising and remembering a Dr. King whom we have romanticized and created in our own image. Dr. King had a dream, yes. And yet, that is not all that Dr. King said. The real Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a prophet. Much like John the Baptist, who said, "Prepare the way for the Lord." He proclaimed God's victory over violence, over the violence of racism and the violence of poverty and the violence of injustice. For it was Dr. King who said, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." He was a man sent to raise our consciousness. So I pray for ears to hear what God's Spirit is speaking to the church in this hour. We pray that we may become more like Jesus. I pray that we will become more like the Middle Eastern, impoverished, Jewish, wrongfully convicted criminal, the God-man Jesus who came to us as a vulnerable baby, whose life was threatened from the very beginning simply because he brought light, threatened the earthly powers, and was not afraid to tell the truth. For that, he suffered. The writer of Hebrews informs us that during the days of his life on earth, he offered up prayers and petitions to God with loud cries and tears, to the one who could save him from death. And he was heard because of his reverent submission. Although he was a son, he learned obedience from what he suffered. And once made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation for all who would obey him. Christ learned obedience and suffered for his commitment to stand against violence on this earth. I pray that we will become more like him. This is the same Jesus who was rejected by his own people when he quoted from the prophet Isaiah to announce his public ministry. The Spirit of the Lord is on me because he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to release the oppressed and proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. Where do we go from here? I pray that we will fervently live out the gospel, which is good news for the poor, the financially poor, and the poor in spirit. The gospel that is good news for the prisoners, those who are incarcerated in this life, and those who are in bondage to sin. The gospel which is good news for those who are blind, those who are spiritually and physically without eyes to see as God desires. The gospel which is good news to the oppressed, the most vulnerable and weak among us. The time is always right to go and live this good news. God bless you, beloved. And if it be the Lord's will, I look forward to seeing you next year.
Thank you all again. And good night to everybody who's been watching, and I look forward to seeing you all in person soon.
Thank you, Martin.
Thank you.
Thank you, Martin.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.
Lord's will. Amen. God bless you.